When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 485, No More Dead Heroes. Last time, as it was clear that Moscow was not going to be taken anytime soon, and this was the first failure of the Wehrmacht, Hitler, in unknown territory, may have overreacted in his attempt to course correct. Initially, on December 1st, von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South, who had reached the doorstep of Rostov-on-Don to the northeast of the Sea of Azov, an impressive feat, was relieved of command as he was unwilling to continue the attack while in the deep throes of winter. In truth, it was his men and their equipment that were unable to continue, but that mattered little to the Nazi warlord, who, if he could not have Moscow now, would have something. Next, the CNC of Army Group Center, von Bock, was relieved on December 19th, again for not only not being able to take Moscow, but for resisting, in his own way, Hitler's not one step back order. Just like Army Group South, much of the failure of Army Group Center came from a lack of needed supplies and reinforcements, not to mention not being outfitted with appropriate winter clothing. And this lack of preparedness has to be laying at the feet of Hitler and the Army High Command. Yet their response would have been, and was, had you taken Moscow, you would have your winter quarters there. But this was semantics. Army Group Center did not have Moscow, and they did not have enough fuel, ammunition, clothing, or food to be an efficient fighting machine, period. Still, Hitler ordered a halt to Army Group Center's retreat, knowing that he would lose thousands of troops and tons of equipment, but it was the only possible path to reapproaching Moscow in the spring. It was a price he was willing to pay, and Hitler would continue to remove anyone who did not share his vision of an eventual triumph in the East. On the other side of the battle lines, Stalin, having recovered his courage as the worst seemed to be over, allowed Zhukov to enter phase 2 of his counterattack, but any additional troops would go to Zhukov's flanks. Having learned nothing, especially the art of restraint, Stalin wanted the northern flank to turn south when it got to Rzhev, about 120 miles or 193 kilometers west by northwest of Moscow, and for the southern flank, now reinforced, to turn north near Bryansk, almost 200 miles or 321 kilometers southwest of Moscow, and together they were to encircle Army Group Center. But not only had Stalin not learned to take what the enemy gave him, the sheer scale of what he envisioned was simply not possible. Not by the Red Army of late 1941, and there was one other simple reason. To see the entirety of Army Group Center fall back must have been intensely satisfying to the Soviet leader and to the Stavka, given how close they came to losing it all. But what they forgot was that they weren't so much beating the enemy as the enemy was not properly prepared to carry out offensive operations. In other words, the Russians weren't beating the Germans per se, they were following and harassing an enemy that simply did not have what it needed to continue, or at the very least, to resist in place, which meant Phase 2 of this great counterattack would meet with a less than glorious ending, as the enemy, per their leader's orders, would turn and stand to fight. And as for what is about to happen to the Soviet forces, untried and untrained as they were, it would be all the more shocking as the local German commanders, unlike the Soviet officers, had more leeway in their execution of orders. Thus, when engaged by Soviet forces, a German officer may choose to stand and fight or fall back, within Hitler's orders, to a better defensive position. The professional German forces were about to get back some of their own, and Stalin was making it easier than it had to be. To be sure, the officers in Army Group Center hated Hitler's stand and fight order on tactical grounds. No, it would have been best to slowly, in an organized fashion, fall back, all the while inflicting heavy casualties on the approaching enemy, and they would have been approaching, thanks to Stalin. And when sufficient reinforcements arrived, to then go over on the offensive. But this was Germany, and an order was an order. Yet if paper beats rock, then ego comes damn close to beating an order. The men of Army Group Center complained to their new leader, General Gunther von Kluge, former commander of the Fourth Army. And as the requests to fall back or straighten out their line came in, Kluge said yes to those requests that he felt would not get the attention of Hitler. It was politics over military necessity all over again. And then there's Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army. He told Kluge, "I am prepared to take these orders and file them. I will not pass them on even under threat of court-martial. I want at least to give my career a respectable ending. I would rather die first." But to borrow from Proverbs, pride goeth before the fall. On December 18th, Zhukov's second phase of attack got underway, and Halder, Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, received Army Group Center's situation report, which simply read, "Attacks everywhere." Specifically, General Hoppner, commander of the 4th Panzer Group, operating to the northwest of Moscow along the Lama River, had been warning for days that he doubted his men could hold this line. Even worse, Reinhardt of the 3rd Panzer Army was saying the same thing due west of Moscow, along the Rusa River, but added he doubted at times if his men would even stop retreating. Their professionalism was breaking down, which is human enough, and now they at least equally thought of saving their own skins as they did protecting the fatherland. Von Bock, not officially out yet as CNC, told his generals, "Hold your fist in the back of your people," which is all well and good to say, but this was the man who was about to lose his job after he told Hitler, "We need to retreat even further to survive." What it all came down to was, by this point, December 20th, much equipment had been lost during the retreat. General Karl Ruoff's 5th Army Corps had lost 300 machine guns and 50 3.7 centimeter and 10 5 centimeter anti-tank guns, and much artillery. It was just as bad for General Goyer's 9th Army Corps, and the fact that truck drivers, now truckless, and artillery crews, now gunless, were sent to the front as reinforcements. This meant little, as there were fewer weapons of any kind to hand out. Why? What had not been lost to the cold was lost during the first few panic days of retreating, when Zhukov came at them strong. And for every one reinforcement that arrived, an almost equal number were killed, wounded, or suffered from frostbite, i.e., no discernible gain in numbers.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
When on the offensive, it's important for a group to work as a whole to maximize the destruction of the enemy, but it's even more important when retreating, for a break in one part of the line can affect everyone. But clearly, this was forgotten during the third week of December. Yet the worst of the lot was General Reinhardt of the 3rd Panzer Army. One loses count of the times he said no to requests for help. When asked for a division, he would grumble and only part with the battalion, or he would say that the condition of the road or lands made it impossible to travel. But travel was obviously possible when he and his were in retreat. The number of German officers who wanted to take a shot at Reinhardt, at least in their diaries, was growing. As the Germans were notorious in their note-taking, the surviving records and diaries are replete with these grown men making excuses as to why a part of their force could not be loaned out to another to stem this or that Soviet tide. There was an outright ignoring of orders, whether, no pun intended, of blaming the weather, or that someone to the right or left had pulled back, so they now had to pull back, to keep the line straight. What followed was local commanders telling their superiors of their retreats, not asking for permission, and those same superiors were not rebuking their subordinates. No one wants to be the last man left or the last man to die on a battlefield. Which is not to say that the Soviet troops had it all their way. Those troops were dying disproportionately to enemy soldiers they killed, which is all Stalin cared about. But local opposition offered up by some German units delivered death to enemy troops in impressive numbers. The irony, though, was attacks of almost any kind burned up more fuel than simply falling back, as well as ammunition. But with the transportation trucks, the very links between the railheads and the various fronts, being unable to keep up with Army Group Center's needs in offense or defense, its overall process was weakening. Not that there weren't moments of success for the Axis troops. On December 24th at Volokolamsk, about 40 miles or 64 kilometers west by northwest of Moscow, 40 Soviet tanks attacked the static defensive position of the Germans. As the weather was somewhat tolerable, Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen's 8th Air Corps sent in bombers. These air attacks, combined with disciplined artillery barrages, saw the few surviving enemy tanks chased away. And it's true that the majority of Soviet attacks on German defensive lines did fail. The point is, they kept coming and coming, which produced what the German officers started calling Panzerfright. The readiness of the panzer crews or their commanding officer to order a tactical retreat was increasing. Thus, it was the volume of Soviet attacks, not the attacks themselves, that was pushing the invaders ever westward. A week or so before this attack, on December 14th, Stalin ordered the removal of demolition charges in Moscow's factories, and before the year was over, he would also order a halt to the end of construction of new defensive works within the city. No, it was time to think of attack, not defense. Meanwhile, as Reinhardt and Hoppner defended themselves along the Lama and Rusa rivers respectively, again just northwest and west of Moscow, their overall northern flank was protected by General Adolf Strauss's 9th Army, itself falling back to the west by southwest from Kalinin. Hitler wanted the 9th Army to keep falling back until it reached Staritsa, about halfway between Kalinin and Rzhev, the point where Stalin wanted the recently reinforced right wing of Soviet forces to turn south to begin encircling Army Group Center. Of course, the Germans did not know of Rzhev's significance, but what Strauss did know was that Staritsa offered little in the way of natural defenses. And if it was his job to protect the northern or left flank of Reinhardt and Hoppner's forces, he needed a stronger position. So, taking a chance, as Hitler was now the commanding officer, Strauss flew to Kluge's headquarters on December 21st to ask if he could fall back all the way to Rzhev, as the Volga River there turns to the northwest and would offer some defense. But Kluge knew that Hitler would not approve this. Bach, before he was ousted, drew up a defensive line that went along these cities, going from north to south: Rzhev, Gzhaks, Orel, and Kursk. Yet Hitler did not factor in the Volga River, so his line, further to the east where it was, seemed no weaker than Bach's line. Thus Kluge told Strauss no to the further retreat, for he did not want the wrath of Hitler coming down on him. No, Strauss and his Ninth Army would make their stand at Staritsa. And adding to Hitler's mistake, General Halder, though noting the continued heavy attacks of the enemy in his diary, told Kluge, "Just hang in there, for surely the Soviets didn't have that many more troops, we've seen this before, and that their offensive would end soon, for they were only human." Human, perhaps, but the Russians were finally winning, and no human wants to stop when they're winning. Besides, it wasn't their call to make. It was Stalin's, and his regard for his men's fatigue was practically non-existent. And at the end of Halder's message to Kluge, he added, "So why back up even more when it will be for nothing?" All this aside, for Hitler, the secret ingredient to success was willpower. Yet even his most ardent followers were saying to each other, yes, willpower is nice, but would it not also be nice to have winter clothing, more men, and more weapons? Not that they had the courage to bring this up to their leader. Even General of Infantry Erich von Manstein, the conqueror of the Crimea, wrote in December, "Such a belief inevitably makes a man impervious to reason and leads him to think that his own will can operate even beyond the limits of hard reality."
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Returning to the fallback of Strauss's Ninth Army under General Strauss was a General Forster's Sixth Army Corps, and under him was a Lieutenant General Alub, the commander of the 6th Infantry Division. Despite Hitler's halt order and Kluge not allowing Strauss to fall back to Rzhev, these two men under Strauss were creating new ways to fall back, not to mention new phrases to justify their retreating. One phrase was the need to take on rearward resistance. But each time Aleb wanted to speed up the retreat, Foster slowed him down, not wanting to get in trouble with Kluge or Hitler. For his panics and pains, Aleb was sacked on Christmas Day. But he would not be the last, but merely the first of many. Of the general retreat of Army Group Center, the way things worked out, with Guderian being pushed back in the south and Strauss's formation trying to outdo each other in creative ways to retreat in the north, Kluge's former 4th Army, southwest of Moscow, was now the furthest eastern penetration of Army Group Center. In fact, by December 18th, 4th Army was still only 68 kilometers, or 42 miles from Red Square. To be sure, plans had been made to fall back, but then came Hitler's halt order. And December 18th was also the day that Zhukov's second offensive phase began. Its target, unsurprisingly, was 4th Army. The bad news for 4th Army was, to them, Hitler's halt order practically spelled their doom. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the 4th Army, would write, "4th Army prepared to fight its final battles." The good news for 4th Army lined up on the western side of the Nara River, mostly to the southwest of Moscow, was that it had built fortifications and dug in before the ground froze, so they were well protected, mostly. So when Zhukov's forces came at Fourth Army, its northern and center sections held, delivering much death to the attackers. No, it was the southern end that created a crisis, and did so straight away. Guderian focused on his own, never bothered to link up his left wing with Fourth Army's right wing, and though his 43rd Army Corps in that area was taken from him and given to the Fourth Army, there was still an open space to its right or south. Zhukov knew some of this through reconnaissance missions and decided to make this point his main thrust. The idea was to fight through whatever little resistance was here, though it turns out there was virtually nothing to fight through, encircle General Henrychi's 43rd Army Corps and push on west to Kaluga. If Soviet troops could reach there, not only would Fourth Army have to worry about defending itself from two sides, but its main communications, supplies, and administration centers would be captured. And no army of this size could survive without those things, certainly not while being attacked in winter. As Heinrici would write to his family on December 19th, one day into Zhukov's attack, before, no one would listen to our warnings. Now, they tell us to sacrifice ourselves to get it right again. This was Hitler's iron will philosophy. But Germany did not need more glorious but dead heroes. No, it needed an army that was allowed to be flexible enough to adapt to any situation. And in the south of Army Group Center, the situation was deteriorating. Not for the last time, Zhukov's plan worked as predicted and hoped for. While other Soviet forces attacked Heinrichi's 43rd Army Corps to keep it pinned down, cavalry, a modest amount of tanks, and infantry on skis moved out right through the gap in between 4th Army and the 43rd Army Corps and Guderian. There wasn't a lot of fighting for this force to do. No one opposed them. Thus, they reached Kaluga on December 21st. That is, they reached the city's edge, which is where they were engaged proper by German forces there, which is where the relatively few Soviet tanks came into the picture. Their job was to punch a hole in the city's defenses to allow the infantry entrance. But at first, the set-up machine guns and anti-tank guns held the Soviet attackers back. Still, the Soviets came on and started circling around their current attacking position. It looked bad for the current masters of Kaluga, so the troops that were unloading two newly arrived trains were ordered to blow them up. Better to lose it and not let the Soviets have what was on board. And what was on board, besides Christmas gifts, was winter clothing. Lots of it. The men grumbled, but blew up the trains and moved away from the rail lines as they expected any moment for Soviet bombers to appear overhead. Meanwhile, at Army High Command, Halder brought up Kaluga and called it a great crisis point. Crisis may be, but Hitler, he hung on to his determination to stem these tides of retreat, no matter what Kluge or his subordinates complained of. And yet, as Kluge and Enrici, certainly the latter, was about to lose their right wing, and Hitler had added his do not retreat order with, don't worry, it will work out, Kluge decided to come up with his own solution. Here's how Enrici put it in a December 22nd letter. I am again standing at the high point of Russian pressure. Basically, we are already fully encircled. Yesterday, the situation was hopeless. We were anticipating our end in the encirclement. At the very last minute, Kluge gave permission to withdraw again. That prolonged our existence a little bit longer. That last bit was tongue-in-cheek, until it seemed it wasn't. On December 22nd, while the ownership of Kaluga was in question, A separate Soviet tank attack hit just above Enrichi's left or northern flank, which is partly why the attack on Kaluga had so few tanks. They were being husbanded for this attack. As things stood, Enrichi's force had the enemy on both flanks. He was cut off from the rest of Fourth Army and was just given permission to retreat. But it was worse for the Fourth Army as a whole. Just above Enrichi's threatened southern end was General of Infantry Han Felber's 8th Army Corps. Now its southern end or right flank was left unprotected, and if the enemy had enough troops, then the main line of Hoppner and Reinhardt could be rolled up, which would be the beginning of the end of Army Group Center as an organized fighting force. So Kluge once again sent in a request to allow the southern end of Army Group Center to retreat, enough to reduce the threat before it. General Halder could not or did not see the real danger, so antagonized Kluge, describing the unfolding situation as uncomfortable. But as the Soviets continued to pound on Kluge, his requests pounded on Berlin. Finally, Hitler agreed to a pullback if there was no other way. There wasn't, so Kluge readied to fall back. Felber's 8th Army Corps retreated to the northwest, semi-tucking itself further into 4th Army, while Enrichi's Army Corps pulled back due west to Kaluga. The opening moves on the chessboard were over. The question remained, what would Zhukov do next, and how would the Germans react? Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So let's see here. I got a couple of members, a couple of people to thank for donations. Let's see here. New members. Frank Wilkins from Columbia, Maryland. Thank you very much, Frank. James Skinner from Dallas, Texas. Thank you very much. And as far as donations, and I loved this, Tim Dolan and his dog Bo from Minnesota donated, and Tim, not Bo, became a member. Well, it might have been Bo. I don't know. I wasn't there. Anyway, so thank you very much, Tim. Let's see here. Jose Mata sent just enough beer money, I think is what his message read. Jose, you were exactly right. Thank you very much. And I received a very nice email from a gentleman called Flip in Minnesota. Clearly, Minnesota is a very nice place where they walk their dogs a lot and listen to history podcasts. Anyway, so as we see now, Army Group Center is having a lot of trouble with Zhukov's counterattacks. There's arrogance on the side of the Germans. There's assumed superiority. What's that? Play the board, not the player. So we'll see what happens with the Army Group Center and if they can recover from this. So until next time, take care, everyone.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the dark disappeared bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.